All right, I want to thank everybody for coming in tonight. So we're just about to start our talk for, I think I know just about everyone here, but I'm Father Writing Chaplain of St. Mary's Chapel and the Rice Catholic Student Center. Tonight our speaker is Father Brian Strassburger. He and I actually go way back about 15 years? All right. About 15 years, we both joined the Jesuits at the same time. So I was going through my pictures today for a few gems. So this is us actually on our vow day, 2013. Those of you that know Father Juan, he's actually up there too. You see him. A few other familiar faces maybe. And then I found this, I just did a search for Brian for my pictures. And so another one, this is actually on my ordination day. We had separate ordination days. I took a few years longer than Father Brian did to get through formation. And so we've had several years together. Brian enjoys hiking, and actually got me into hiking a lot more, kind of outdoors, going out quite a bit. And especially during COVID, Father Brian found that going hiking, and especially trying to hike all of, what was the total number? 48 of the peaks that are in the Northeast, the White Mountains. So that was his COVID project, and he accomplished it. And so I was on a few of those, not all 48, but a few of those. So on this particular trip, I think it was just the two of us, and there was a lot of snow on this path. And so the path itself had packed snow. But if you veer just a little bit off the path, you might sink several feet immediately. And that happened to me. So we're just going down the path, and I quickly just sank right in there. And of course we have this photo because instead of helping me, Mother Brian took out his camera and took many photos. This is only one of them that I have. Took many, many photos. And of course I'm laughing too because I would have done the exact same thing. In fact, I did. Because not too long after making fun of me for sinking through the snow, Father Brian did the exact same thing, and I have many more photos than that as well. And most of them he's smiling, laughing, in most of them. But we've had a lot of fun over the past several years, and since then we both, through our formation, have been brought into different ministries. In particular, I did not see myself here, but it was a beautiful part of our Jesuit vocation that was being called to come here into a ministry that I wouldn't have imagined but very much love. And I remember talking with Father Brian in the time leading up to his first assignment and being called to the ministry that he is now doing in Brownsville. In fact, being called to start a ministry in Brownsville. And so, sorry, that was one more. That was the cue to be on time. This is a whole other story about a little competition that Father Brian loves competitions, especially making them up on the spot. And so he made up a competition that he finally won, which is predicting the times it would take for us to get back to our cars from the peak of the mountain. And it was. In fact, I could read it. It's 2:08. That was the And that was the point. He wanted proof. So I took the picture and saved it so I could use that photo today. Who knew? But an amazing thing about our Jesuit vocation, something I love about the Jesuits in general, is some of you might know that Jesuits are known a lot for education in particular. But the fact of the matter is, even how we got into education, is that part of our charism is doing what is needed where we are. And so looking into the needs of the local area, the needs of Catholics in that area, needs that are being called out by bishops in that area, and being called to do whatever is necessary for the people there. And so we find ourselves in many different ministries. Father Brian and I have really grown up together in the Society of Jesus and become brothers through that process. And now we do very different ministries, but because of the same charism. So it is very exciting for me to be able to welcome my brother, Father Brian.
Thank you, Father Tucker. It's great to be with you all today. As he said, my name is Father Brian Strassburger, and I'm the director of Del Camino Jesuit Order Ministries. We take our name from Our Lady of the Way, Nuestra Senora del Camino, which is a popular devotion of St. Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits. And many migrants that we meet turn to Our Lady for intercession on the migrant journey, and so that's how we took our name. What I'd like to talk to you about today is how do we accompany migrants in the reality that they face, a reality that includes kidnapping, exploitation, criminalization. I think this is a topic that's really fresh on our minds because of what's happening in our country right now. And I want to share from my own experiences for the past several years, living on the border, accompanying migrants not only on the border, but throughout the country. So just a brief overview, I'm going to introduce our ministry. I'm going to talk about the current dynamic, really through the lens of sharing stories of people that I know and accompany. I'm going to reflect on a Catholic approach to immigration, what the light of the Catholic faith can share with us, and that I think many of us, as people with goodwill, can connect to. And I'll end by offering some concrete, practical suggestions for how to get involved and be involved in this issue. So let me begin. I was ordained a Catholic priest in the summer of 2021, and for my first mission, I was invited to go to Brownsville, Texas, on the U.S.-Mexico border. There was no Jesuit presence there. They weren't staffing a Newman Center University. They weren't running a high school like Straight Jesuit or Cristo Rey, Jesuit high schools that are here in town. And so when we arrived, we met with the local bishop, Bishop Daniel Flores, and in that conversation, he gave us the mission that I think we continue to live out today, because he said to us, I want you to do what Jesuits do best. And we kind of paused, like he said, not like a bad joke, you know? And he said, no, I want you, and he didn't say, I want you to found a great high school or a great university or staff a parent. He said, I want you to read the reality and respond to it. Read the reality and respond to it. And so that's what we set about to do. And what grew out of that was Del Camino Jesuit Border Ministries. And our mission is to offer privileged and preferential religious care to the poor, with a focus on pastoral accompaniment and sacramental ministry on the migrant population on both sides of the U.S.-Mexico border. We are an itinerant ministry. What does that mean? It means we don't run a migrant shelter. We don't have kind of a brick-and-mortar institution. We're a mobile team of 3 Jesuits, which makes us flexible. We can go where the needs are greatest. If there's more needs on the U.S. side or on the Mexican side, in one city or another, we can be mobile and itinerant and adjust as necessary in discerning light. Our ministry also includes a lot of other components that I'll touch on briefly, like humanitarian aid, collaboration, immigration advocacy. What does it look like then? That's our mission. So what does it look like? Well, principally, we celebrate Mass. So we're a team of Jesuits, and as priests, it's one of the things that we decided was like a thing that could set us apart from another NGO going into a migrant camp or shelter to accompany people. So what it might look like is even in a space like this, we might just set up a folding table and bring our Mass kit and turn it into our altar and invite people to pull up chairs or benches and gather around us for a moment of prayer. What we found is that that can be a very moving and touching moment for a migrant in the midst of their journey and all the things that they're carrying. To have a space that's familiar, a space that's holy and sacred, a space that allows some silence and reverence and prayer, to feel God's presence and to create community among those who gather together. And what it also does is it builds up this trusted relationship. As we come regularly, we usually visit any shelter we go to 2 times a week, and so it helps us to get to know people on our visits. And as we get to know people, we hear their stories. We can have pastoral conversations, talking to them about the struggles, you know. A year and a half ago, it wasn't uncommon that every time I was showing up in the shelter, a migrant would come up, newly arrived at the shelter, and they would just be so exasperated, and they would say, I just got released from being kidnapped by the cartel. This was a common occurrence. Almost half the migrants I met a couple years ago were being kidnapped by local cartels in Mexico. And they all had stories to share, things to unburden, the suffering that they were carrying, and to gather around the altar and to pray to the crucified Christ. That's not the end of his story. He too rose again 3 days later, offering us freedom from sin and death. And to share that pastoral journey with people is very moving and important part and fundamental to our ministry. But the good thing is, as we build up this trusted relationship by coming and celebrating Mass regularly, we can help in a couple of different ways. One thing we can do is that we can help elevate the on-the-ground concerns with other advocates, journalists, government officials. For example, in the city of Matamoros, Mexico, there was a trend where migrants were arriving and showing up, coming to the airport from Mexico City, and then as they got out of the airport, the taxis were just turning them over to the cartels. That was part of the way that was facilitating the kidnapping of migrants. And how do we know about it? Because they told us. And so after hearing that from a handful of people, we talked to other advocates, we talked to officials in Matamoros, municipal officials, and they started providing a free bus ride for migrants to get from the airport to the shelters to help prevent those types of kidnapping. So that's a way our advocacy, hearing the on-the-ground story, can help elevate issues and concerns. We're also then able to pass information the other direction. We participate in advocacy calls, we're familiar with U.S. border dynamics, and we can help to orient people as they come up to the U.S.-Mexico border. Right? It's not uncommon. Migrants get their information, like a lot of us, on social media. Right? And so there's a lot of reliable information on social media from credible news sources, and there's a lot of fake news and false rumors. Right? It's not uncommon. It's like International Day of Migrants and Refugees is coming up, and people are asking me, is it true that they're going to open up the border on that day for anybody who wants to cross? No, it's certainly not true. We've never done that. And so, please don't make plans to try to show up at the border that day. It's not going to go the way you might hope or think. And so we're able to help pass information down, provide accurate orientations about border dynamics, and help accompany migrants. So that's the heart of our ministry, these trusted relationships built through our sacramental ministry. When I say sacramental ministry, I mean something like celebrating the Catholic Mass, or it could be other sacraments, which I'll touch on a little bit later. We also bring humanitarian aid, addressing the needs of people. We do advocacy on a local and even a national level. And we do our communications work. We've got a weekly newsletter. We've got a podcast that we'll talk a little bit more about in another moment later on. So I want to get back to that question of Bishop Flores when we first met him. He said, read the reality and respond to it. All right, let's talk about the reality of the U.S.-Mexico border. The current dynamic is that there is no legal entry for asylum seekers on the U.S.-Mexico border. I'm careful to use the language. A lot of times we use the language say the border is now closed. And I don't like that language because for one, it implies that the border used to be open, and it was not an open border as we tend to conceive that politically. As someone who lived there throughout the Biden administration, it was very closed and regulated. It was very hard to get legal entry even if you were fleeing violence and seeking asylum. Often people were waiting for 6, 8, 10, 12 months for legal entry in the United States to seek asylum. So I don't like the language of it was an open border, because it wasn't, and nor can we say it's a closed border. I cross the border 5 times a week. In fact, the U.S.-Mexico border is the most crossed international border in the entire world. People from the town I live in, Brownsville, cross into Mexico to go to the pharmacy, get their dental work done because prices are better there. People from Mexico cross in the United States, they do their Christmas shopping, or maybe the kids go to school there if they're U.S. citizens or born in the U.S., maybe the family lives in Mexico. Very transnational border, so you see a lot of that. The border, if we're going to say it's closed, because obviously it's not, there's a lot of crossings every single day, but it is closed to the poor and the vulnerable. If you're wealthy or privileged, if you're born in the United States of America, or you've got a big bank account, you can get a U.S. visa, it's very much open to you. If you're poor and vulnerable, seeking safety and security, those are the people we don't want in. So that's a little bit of the dynamic right now, and it did change dramatically on January 20th. On January 20th of last year, when the Trump administration was sworn in for the second time, the one legal pathway for entry that was left for migrants fleeing situations of violence, seeking asylum, was a smartphone app called CBP1. You download it on your phone, you'd ask for an appointment, and you wait for that appointment. On January 20th of last year, while Trump was still being sworn in the Capitol, all the dignitaries were still in that Capitol building, a message went out to every user in Mexico of that application saying, this application will no longer be used for non-citizens to seek entry, and all scheduled appointments are permanently canceled. Now, when you get an appointment, it was usually for 3 weeks out. So on January 20th, there were people at appointments for the 21st, the 22nd, all the way up into the early part of February. And now they found out all of those appointments had been canceled. They weren't going to be able to seek entry for asylum. That included Edwin and his family. Edwin, if you can believe this story, he's from Colombia. His teenage son, 13, 14-year-old son, was starting to get recruited by the local gang. He just did not want his son being part of that. And when the threats got significant, when his son wasn't joining, they decided, we got to get out of here. They fled up to the U.S.-Mexico border. They were waiting for their appointment in Mexico City, and they got their appointment for January 15th. Okay, January 15th, that's still 5 days before the change, so that probably worked out for them, right? Well, Edwin and his family, they took a bus to come up to the U.S.-Mexico border, and as their bus was coming into town, this guy came on, he looked kind of officially dressed, and he said, any migrants who have an appointment with the CBP1 app, I'd like you to please come off the bus with me. And they got off the bus, a little bit nervous, and then that gentleman informed them, you have now been kidnapped by the Gulf Cartel. He covered their heads and took them in a secured vehicle to another location where they were held, kidnapped, and their family had to scrap together money to pay a ransom, $2,000 for each of the three of them, so $6,000. They were able to get family to pull that money together and pay the ransom, and they got out of being kidnapped 5 days later on January 18th. They were in a different, they were in Reynosa, they needed to get them out the Moors about an hour away. The morning of the 19th, advocates get them to the border. They show up to present to Border Patrol. We and other advocates have been working, coordinating with Mexican and U.S. immigration to say, if someone misses their appointment because they were kidnapped, if we submit their information, Border Patrol would process them after their appointment date, because not to anyone's surprise, there's not like a button on the app that's like, I missed my appointment because I was kidnapped. Although they probably should have put one in there, because it was happening so regularly. So anyway, they showed up on the 19th, they're there a day before the 20th, there are people getting let in with their CBP-1 appointment, and when they get up there, the CBP officers say, I'm sorry, we're over capacity today, come back tomorrow. And tomorrow, the next day, was January 20th, when the announcement went out that CBP-1 appointments would no longer be there. Edwin and his wife and son continue to remain in Matamoros, Mexico, 13 months later. Not for any fault of their own. They got the appointment, they were doing things the right way, they were kidnapped, and that's why they missed their appointment. They got out of their kidnapping before the change of government, but because of capacity issues, they remain in a shelter in Mexico. So, in talking about that dynamic on the border, I want to talk about both sides of the border. So, there's the U.S. side of the border, where border shelters now in places like McAllen, Texas, or Brownsville are basically empty. And what we know is that migrants from other countries are living in real fear. The government has said it's run on a campaign of mass deportations. It keeps emphasizing we want to get rid of all these violent criminals among us in this undocumented population. But there is a problem with that proposal. Because as it turns out, migrants commit crimes at a lower rate than U.S. citizens, and it's only about 3% of the migrant population that have ever been convicted of any crime. So how do you make it work? Mass deportation, small amount of criminals. Well, you can do one of two things. You can not have mass deportations, but the government hasn't elected for that. The other option is to criminalize migrants. How exactly do you do that? Well, the government's employing a wealth of strategies. One is you could require registration for undocumented migrants. To enter the country undocumented, it's only a misdemeanor. It's a civil offense, not a criminal offense. It's like speeding and getting a traffic ticket, okay? I mean, I don't know if anyone here is fed, but if so, we've got illegals among us, okay? And so if you require, the Trump administration in the early part of its term in April of last year, put a rule in the law that now an undocumented migrant is required by federal law to register. Basically go online and say, here's my name, and here's where I live, and I am an undocumented migrant. I mean, who would even do that, right? It's like, why would I do that in a campaign of mass deportations? But here's the problem. If you don't do it, you've now broken federal law, and now it is a criminal offense. See how we're making criminals, right? Another thing you can do is you can revoke legal status, making people suddenly undocumented. Today, actually I haven't even heard the latest news, but today, tomorrow, TPS for Haiti, for people from Haiti, that's a temporary protected status. It's something that we grant to members of a certain country when that country is not in a position to receive deported citizens, often after natural disasters. So Haitians have had access to temporary protected status to not be deported out of the U.S. to Haiti since an earthquake happened in 2010. Now, since then, it has not gotten on its feet very well. In fact, a few years ago, the president of the country was assassinated. They haven't established a firm government since then, so it is a very tenuous country. It's basically a failed state. And yet our government is saying, that temporary status isn't really valid anymore, so we're going to revoke it. And now any Haitian that is here protected under the law with that status is now going to be exposed to deportation, okay? Or else have to self-deport, creating criminals. Another thing you can do is just strip people's legal status. People entered the country in the last couple of years of the Biden administration, a lot of them were using that smartphone app I talked about. Others came in through a parole program for people from Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. That's the 4 letters in that acronym. And they were granted a temporary status here. They could legally apply for parole or for asylum, and they could get a work permit. And the Trump administration has said, okay, actually, I think we can just revoke those statuses. And so now that entire population all of a sudden becomes undocumented and subject to deportation. We can broaden definitions of gang membership. There's a scorecard that DHS uses, that ICE uses to determine if someone is a gang member. And it's all scored by points, and some of the things that give you the most points are if you have tattoos that might be suggestive of gang membership. Okay? Or they find social media posts that might be suggestive of gang membership. What does that include? Wearing Chicago Bulls gear. Because there's suspicion that that means you're a member of the MS-13 gang out of El Salvador. Now, that doesn't mean you're even from El Salvador. They use that against people who are from Venezuela and say, oh, there's pictures of him wearing a Chicago Bulls shirt, and that scores points on your way of getting detained and deported and being categorized as a criminal. And then, of course, our government is using all kinds of novel strategies to curtail due process, increase detention, and fast-track deportation. I want to share a couple stories, though, to put this in context. So the first story I want to share is about my friend Isis Perez. He's a young man from Venezuela, former Catholic seminarian, came up to the border in January 2024, so about 2 years ago now. Isis, former Catholic seminarian, when he saw a couple of priests coming in to celebrate Mass, he was so excited. He's like, can I help? Can I be a lector or a Eucharistic minister? He got involved with our Masses twice a week. And then after a couple of days, a week or so of going there, he said, Father Brian, gosh, it's so good that you come twice a week and say Mass, but I just feel like we need more. I know I need more. Would it be okay with you? Okay, you need my permission. Would it be okay with you if I started organizing a rosary group every day to pray the rosary? It's like, yeah. He says, that'd be fine with me. That'd be great. And that's what he did. He started organizing a rosary. People to gather to pray the rosary once a day, every day. Well, after a few weeks in the shelter, he got his CBP-1 appointment to legally enter the country to seek asylum. Came into the U.S., went up to Michigan, started living and working there. Fast forward to 2025, a new government came into the office, and in April of last year, Isis had his regular check-in with immigration, an ICE check-in, usually happens every 6 to 12 months. In previous times, that used to be a pretty routine thing. Isis went to his check-in with ICE, and he was immediately detained. They detained him, they went through the scorecard that I was talking about. Isis, a young man, a single man from Venezuela, he's got sleeve tattoos. The guy likes tattoos. Score that for points. So they said that he is a suspected member of the Tren de Aragua gang, which we are supposedly under an invasion from, and so he's not safe for the American public for him to be free. They're going to detain him. Sure, they said, you can continue with your asylum claim, but you can't do it while living and working in your apartment in Michigan. You have to do it while detained, which the U.S. government is very clear to use words like detention centers versus prisons, but having been in them, it's the same thing. I mean, this is a person who is now in prison, wearing a uniform, having to file in line, living behind bars, restrictions on all of his movements, and access to the outside world. And so Isis was detained. He had his court dates twice postponed in August and in October. Delaying in the court when someone is detained is a great strategy for them to get to a point where they're going to say, I give up. In November, Isis finally got to that point. He said, he's got a good claim for asylum. He's politically active in Venezuela against the Maduro government. He's got videos, he's got evidence. He's got a good case for asylum. He's got a lawyer to help defend it. But after over 6 months detained, living in prison, knowing that even the asylum process is multiple hearings and a potential appeal from the government, the idea of thinking, I might be living like this for another year or more, I'd rather go home to Venezuela, a place that he doesn't even feel safe being in. And so in November, he went before a judge and submitted a motion saying, I withdraw my claim for asylum, please just deport me, please get me out of detention, a place where I should have, he's been abused. Well, Isis thought, okay, I've given in, I've thrown in the towel, get me out of here. But it's not even that easy, because deportation to Venezuela is complicated. We don't have great diplomatic relationships with that country. And so in December, they put a pause completely on deportation flights. Of course, then we know at the start of this year, our government extracted the leader and his wife, Nicolas Maduro and his wife, from that country. And just about 2 weeks ago, they restarted deportation flights, and Isis, after an additional 6 weeks of being detained, actually 2 months, an additional 2 months, was finally sent back to Venezuela. He's not safe there. He does not feel safe there. And so he's trying to make plans to flee the country again, seek safety in a country more willing to receive him in his vulnerability. Another story I'd like to share is the story of Carlos. Carlos I met last summer. I went to immigration court in Harlingen. You would think a courthouse is a place of justice being properly served. And yet what's happening is, maybe you've heard stories around the country, immigration court has become a facade. Someone like Carlos comes in, he's entered the country legally in 2019, he's been following the process to apply for asylum. This was just his regular check-in. He's from, or his regular court audience with the judge. From Nicaragua, he fled there in 2019 after civil unrest that broke out in the country. He was politically active against the Ortega government. And as he showed up in court that day, he was ready. He was taking notes. The judge was explaining to him the next steps in his process. He was asking questions to make sure everything was clear. He was going to have another court date coming up in 2026 where he was going to have to present the merits of his claim. He didn't have a lawyer yet because he had a lawyer, and that lawyer probably wasn't a real lawyer and was taking advantage of him, so he was in the process of finding another one. It all looked like everything was happening like normal. After a half an hour of this back and forth, the judge turns to the other person in the room who's sitting at a bench across from Carlos, and it's a representative of DHS, the Department of Homeland Security. And she says, does the government have anything to say in this case? And this guy, who's just been kind of typing on his laptop the whole time, leans into the microphone and says, yes, Your Honor, the government moves to dismiss this case. And Carlos is like, wait, what, dismiss my case? I'm trying to fight for asylum claim. And the judge says, okay, well, the government is the one prosecuting you for illegal status in the country, so since they want to close the case, we are closing the case. And with that, Carlos walked out of the room confused. What does this mean for me? Now he's not in the normal legal process. And so what did that mean? That meant that 2 masked ICE agents were waiting outside. They put him in handcuffs and took him in a van. Carlos has been in the country for 6 years. He's got a son who was born here, 4 years old. He didn't get to go back and pack up his bags. He didn't get a kiss at 75. He was sent to a detention facility, moved to Louisiana, where he's held for a couple of weeks, and he's deported back to Nicaragua, the country he had fled for fear of his safety. Immigration court turning into a facade of justice. And that's all part of this novel strategy that the Trump administration has used and said, well, when someone doesn't have an active case in immigration court, we can subject them to what we call expedited removal, which is exactly what it sounds like, a fast track to deport someone. So by closing down the case in court, picking him up with ICE, you can say, he's got no active case, let's put an expedited removal, let's get him out of here as quickly as we can. Campaign of mass deportation. So that's a little bit about what's happening in the U.S. Now let me talk a little bit about what's happening in the Mexican side. As I mentioned at the beginning, access to the U.S. for migrants and asylum seekers has effectively been eliminated. And so what that means is that migrant shelters in northern Mexico, the population there is very low. A shelter that might have had a few hundred people on it, in it now might have a few dozen people in it. Because people have made decisions. You know, when there's an opportunity for legal entry, what I've found in my 4.5 years working on the board is that people get in line. If you say you use the smartphone app, you might have to wait a few months, but you can legally enter the country and seek refuge. People will wait. And that can cause a shelter population to grow to 200 people as they're waiting in line, so to speak. But now when there's no wait, there's no line to get in, people have to make decisions for their life. And they're basically left with 4 decisions to make starting in January of last year. One is, okay, there's no legal entry in the United States, so how else can I get into the United States? So we're talking about illegal or undocumented entry, right? Not to present yourself to Border Patrol, but basically try to sneak past Border Patrol and end up in the United States. The price for that instantly quadrupled, and now it costs around $14,000 to $15,000 per person, so it instantly prices most people out of even attempting to do it. And that money we're paying to the cartel or human smugglers. Not always the same thing, but sometimes some overlap. And so, you know, I know maybe a small handful of people, less than 15 people I know have attempted to do this. Some, like Jorge, he crossed, was not able to make it past Border Patrol. He was picked up, he was detained, he was held at a detention center for several weeks, and then deported back to Honduras for spending all that money. But another woman, a young woman I know, Rosie, she made it up to Houston, here where she's united with her husband, who she's been separated with for a few years because he came up to the U.S. before she did and came into the country legally. And so I asked her, I was like, man, how was it, you know, a woman traveling alone, just kind of nervous about the risk she'd be exposed to? She's like, oh, Father Brian, it's a piece of cake, I just rode in the car. She just drove across the border. Because when you're paying $14,000, $15,000, sometimes some of that might go to a Border Patrol agent who just waves your car by, even if you don't have permission for legal entry. So corruption can exist in our system as much as in any other government system. Other people, if they don't, most people I know don't want to enter the country undocumented illegally. They know how tenuous that existence even is. You know, even if you make it successfully in the U.S., congrats, now you're undocumented in the U.S., it's a tenuous existence. Some people have returned home, especially if they think it's safe enough to do so. Karen decided to do so with her 2 kids. Karen's a single mom from Honduras. She She was there with 2 kids, like I said. She helped out in the shelter in the kitchen, helping her prepare the meals for people every single day. And just had a great heart, this really big smile, just a delight and a pleasure to be around. One day, the border closed January 20th. She had an appointment with CBP1, it got canceled, it was for early February. And she kept waiting to see, like, maybe something will change, maybe there will be some lawsuit that opens up the border, or they at least honor the appointments that were canceled. But once it got to summer, last summer, it was kind of like, that's not happening, that's clearly not happening, or if it's happening, it's not anytime soon. And so I remember that day I went into the kitchen at that shelter, and she was there sharing with me that her decision, and she decided to head home. And she got really emotional, because she said, Father Brian, my family is telling me to send my 2 kids without me. Now, if kids under the age of 18 enter the United States, they get processed differently than adults. And if you have family members who are in the country, they could theoretically get released to those family members. And so then they could go to school and follow the legal process and potentially stay here after entry as unaccompanied minors. And Karen has a sister living in Dallas with papers documented. And so she said her family was telling her, just send your kids. If you can't enter, just send your kids. And she looked at me and she said, I just can't do that. Is it? She started crying. She said, am I a bad mother? Because I don't want to be separated from my children. And I looked at her and I said, Karen, you're not a bad mother. It's so important for these kids, your kids, to have you with them. Right? You're making the right decision for you and your family. And so that week, gave her a blessing, and she said goodbye, and got on a bus to take a plane, and got returned to Honduras, where she's living with her mom. It's not the greatest situation, but she's separated from the husband, and she's fleeing domestic violence, and she's got her kids. They're enrolled back in school. They're thriving. So when I talked to Karen, got a big smile on her face, and really happy to have her family close. Another option is that people are trying to establish themselves in Mexico. I mean, there are people that have told me, looking in the face, and said, if I go back to my home country, I'm a dead man. I can't do it. I fled for a reason, right? And so they try to establish themselves in Mexico. Now, the tough thing about that is, well, so for example, they'll go to bigger, safer cities, Mexico City, Monterrey, but they face challenges there too, because most migrants who are in Mexico, who are non-Mexican nationals, who are waiting to enter the United States, don't have a legal status in Mexico either. So they're an undocumented population in that country, so they might not have a work permit, right? There are ways to regularize your status in Mexico that are a little bit easier, but they can be costly and they can take time. So that's some of the challenges people are faced. Angelo, a guy from Haiti, went down to Monterrey, got a job in construction right away, found an apartment for himself. He's doing great, right? But another woman, Yasmin, she went down to Monterrey as well with her kids. She can't work during the day because she's got to care for her kids, so she's still living in a shelter all these months later. So not necessarily working out the same for everybody. And then the last option is that you just wait in a border shelter. So like I said, very low population. The biggest shelter might have 70 or 80 people there. It's mostly families. Mostly people have young children. Some single mothers, others families with a couple that are there together. And so what are they doing? They're trying to establish themselves. They just can't afford their own housing. So they send their kids to school. They might look for work. Otherwise, they stay in the shelter, waiting to see if some change comes or a legal pathway opens. A new population that's begun to arrive in Mexico are deportees. So when the Trump administration took over, the Mexican government, under Claudia Sheinbaum, the president of Mexico, opened up a series of shelters along the border under a program called Mexico Te Abraza. Mexico embraces you to receive repatriated or deported Mexicans. So, for example, there's a shelter in Matamoros, Mexico, that's receiving around 180 to 200 deported Mexicans every single day. And so that's a new population. Now, when they go to that shelter, they're processed by the Mexican government. They're given the equivalent of $100 in pesos. They're given 3 months of health insurance, and then a bus ticket to a town that's close to their final destination. But we witness there also a very vulnerable population. Of course, there's no caps on the amount of Mexicans that can be deported because it's their country. And there are agreements between the U.S. and Mexico for the U.S. to deport people in Mexico who aren't even Mexican. So right now there's a large number of Cubans, not from Mexico, being deported from the United States into Mexico. And they have a limit on that to 1,000 per month. But the Trump administration is trying to use every one of those 1,000 spots every month of deporting Venezuelans, Cubans, Haitians, into Mexico. So let me share a couple stories just kind of paint the picture of the dynamic. And both these stories are framed around December 24th, the celebration of Christmas. Christmas Eve, we're doing Christmas masses. So the first shelter we went to on Christmas Eve was the Caffrey shelter. That's the one in Matamoros receiving these deported migrants. It's a really tender, vulnerable place to encounter people. It's their first moments in Mexico, right, after being deported. Now, for some of them, they've been in the U.S. for a couple of years. They're adults. They were just in Mexico. They have family. But we're meeting people that have spent most of their life in the United States. I mean, we've met people who came to the United States as toddlers who speak English better than Spanish, who don't have family in Mexico and are trying to figure out what they're going to do now. On Christmas Eve, I met Juliana, and I sat down next to Juliana, a woman in her probably in her mid-50s, and I asked her, how long were you in the United States, Juliana? She said, 29 years. Wow, 29 years. Do you have kids? She said, yeah, I've got 5 of them. The oldest is 19, and the youngest is my 6-year-old son. I said, gosh, how did you get picked up by immigration? She said, well, you know, with the kids that I have and dependents that depend on me, I was going through some legal processes where I could have regularized my status in the U.S., and I went to court, and their ICE agents, and they picked me up. They dismissed my case, put me in detention. I was detained for 3 months, and they picked Christmas Day to deport me back to Mexico. I said, you know, Father Brian, I just keep thinking about it. I was like, man, if I would just skipped out on court that day, I'd be celebrating Christmas with my kids. And instead, here I am at this migrant shelter in northern Mexico. It's a depressing reality that we face and encounter, but there's also a lot of light. And that same day, after finishing that conversation with Juliana, celebrating Mass there, we went to Casa del Migrante shelter, where we celebrated, as part of our Christmas celebration, 10 baptisms and 2 first communions. And that includes Judy and her family. Judy, a single mom fleeing a situation of domestic violence herself, got her oldest son Byron and her other daughter Nayeli, and she came to the shelter, she came to the border pregnant. And so she did eventually give birth in late September to her daughter, Doris and Scarlett, who was the youngest child. I'm a priest, I can't have kids, if you didn't know that. And so Doris and Scarlett was the youngest child that I ever held because she gave birth in the hospital, and then 2 days later she was released from the hospital. That happened to be the day I was at the shelter, and she said, oh, here, hold her. And I was like, oh my gosh, I don't want to break this thing, I don't know what I'm doing. So the youngest child that I ever held. And so Judy asked us, she said, you know, Doris is just born. Actually, my 2 other kids haven't received any sacraments of initiation. We said, of course, let's do it. So Sister Gloria, the medic of the presentation, sister, helped us with formation for these families, the parents, for young children, and some of the kids who are a little bit older, some catechism. And on Christmas Day, I mean, it was so beautiful. Right? Everybody dressed up, the kids in their white, but the parents and mothers and fathers dressed up, everyone in the shelter. I've never celebrated baptisms on Christmas, but what a beautiful thing. The day that we celebrate the light entering the world, Christ's birth. What a beautiful thing to celebrate the new birth brought about by the waters of baptism, that sacramental ministry, the sense of joy. These were things like celebrating first communions and baptisms were things we weren't doing before because people were coming to the border and crossing within a reasonable amount of time. So one of the benefits of people staying in a shelter for a long time is that you can help to deepen their sense of faith, and they come to us seeking sacraments and seeking that kind of ministry. So the light that continues to shine amid the darkness. There were 10 kids that were baptized. This is the last thing I'll say about baptism. 10 kids baptized that day, and they were asking, like, you know, what do you need for someone to be a godparent, a godfather, godmother? It's like, we only technically need 1 for each of the kids. You can have more than 1. And so the godparents for every one of the 10 kids were the 3 Jesuit priests. So we had double duty. So we got to do the sacrament. And who's the godfather? So I've become the godfather of a lot of kids in the time here on the board. So I want to return to that question that I originally started with, right? What is read the reality and respond to it? So I shared a little bit about the reality on the U.S. side, on the Mexican side. And I'd like to talk about what it means to respond to this reality that we encounter. Well, our response as a team of Jesuits in the Catholic Church is informed by our faith. And so our response is, of course, a Catholic response. And our faith is abundantly clear on how important it is to care for the stranger, to care for the migrant in our midst. In fact, it pains me when I hear people professing the Christian faith, including politicians, and saying that, and justifying a campaign of mass deportation, right? Justifying what's happening around the country right now, justifying the wounds inflicted on people whose stories I've shared, because that for me doesn't echo the faith that I profess. A faith that is rich in its scriptures. There are dozens of times in the Old Testament saying that line, "You shall not oppress or afflict the foreigner, for you are foreigners residing in the land of Egypt." Jesus himself was a refugee. Right? Remember the story of him in Matthew about how the Lord appeared to Joseph and said, rise, take the child, flee to Egypt. Why? Because of an oppressive government. Herod was going to kill kids. Get out of there. He fled, seeking safety and asylum in another land. We have words like the great judgment scene where Jesus talks about, I was hungry, you fed me. I was thirsty, you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. And they asked him, well, when did we do that? He said, whenever you do it for the least of these, you've done it for me. I think about St. Paul writing that there are many parts and yet one body, and if one part suffers, all parts suffer with it. And how when I see the suffering of the crucified Christ in the stories I've shared, it pains me as a member of the body of Christ. Hospitality has long been a marker of the church from ancient times during the Roman Emperor to the rule of St. Benedict, the early Benedictines. Even today, the Catholic Church is the largest global social service provider, and it was the largest refugee resettlement program in the United States until the Trump administration cut all the funding and cut refugee resettlement from several tens of thousands to 7,500. The only people who can apply right now, white South Africans. We can't ignore the racial undertones of immigration policy today. And then, of course, along with our history and tradition, Catholic social teaching, it talks about a preferential option for the poor. It basically says that when we look at a policy, we should judge it first by the way that it impacts the poor. That's what our faith literally invites us to. Look at any policy we're proposing, and the first question to ask is, how is it going to affect the most poor and vulnerable? Okay, let me describe our immigration policy. The border is closed if you don't have a visa. Okay, who doesn't have a visa? The poor and vulnerable. Who does have a visa? The wealthy. If Shakira, who's a Colombian national, wants to come to the United States, put on a series of concerts, you know who gets a visa really easily? Shakira. That's great. I got nothing wrong with Shakira. I don't have a visa, right? But if Catalina, who fled Colombia because her mother was murdered, comes to the U.S.-Mexico border and wants a visa, guess what? Catalina doesn't get a visa to enter the United States of America, right? So our immigration policy is a preferential option for the wealthy, right, and the privileged. In fact, there's talks about a gold card. I don't know if you guys have heard about this. Trump is proposing a gold card with FaceTime. It said, you give just $1 million donation to our government, you get a gold card, legal entry to come to the United States, when and wherever you want, like a permanent visa. The preferential option for the wealthy. And then, of course, recently, maybe you've heard this, maybe happened in November of last year, the U.S. bishops around the country were gathered in D.C. and issued a special statement. They've only do this about every 10 years. It's very rare. Only in matters of greater moment. And they issued a special message lamenting the situation, the tax and migrants, the enforcement tactics of this government. They said in a clear voice, we oppose the indiscriminate mass deportation of people, which is exactly what's happening right now. It's what's happening in the streets of Minneapolis and the streets of cities around the United States. Indiscriminate. I think it's really important to name that because the government says it's targeted. It's targeted enforcement. We're going after criminals. And what often happens, I've seen reports on the news where it's like, we picked up 150 people today, and let me read you some of them. There was this guy who was convicted of being a pedophile. This other guy has an assault conviction, and they stop at like 3 or 4 or 5. Don't get me wrong, the government is detaining and deporting the worst of the worst. They are. They're picking them up. What I'd like to see is the list of the other 175 people that they picked up today. That might include a 5-year-old child like Liam, that you saw the pictures of him as he got picked up in Minneapolis, right? That counts in the statistics as well, but it is, which indicates to us it's not targeted, it's indiscriminate. Our response also includes spiritual care. We take a lot of inspiration by the words of Pope Francis, who wrote in Evangelical Gaudium. Pope Francis, just a tremendous advocate for migrants around the world. Very sad to see him pass away in April of last year. But it couldn't have been more fitting. It was Easter Monday. He celebrated Easter Mass, celebrated the Lord's resurrection with the people of God. And the next day, he celebrated the Lord's resurrection with the Lord himself as he entered into his eternal rest. But he wrote in Evangelical Gaudium, I want to say with regret that the worst discrimination with which the poor suffer is the lack of spiritual care. The great majority of the poor have a special openness to the faith. They need God. We must not fail to offer them his friendship, his blessing, his word, the celebration of the sacraments, and a journey of growth and maturity in the faith. Our preferential option for the poor must mainly translate, he says, into a privileged and preferential religious care. Those are words that inspire us since our ministry is spiritual ministry. It's bringing the sacraments to those on the margins. It's celebrating Mass in a migrant shelter. You know, God doesn't live in just the beautiful cathedrals and churches of the world. God lives in each and every one of us. And we make a space sacred when we gather together when 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I am with you. Right? And so that's what we see, and that's what we practice in our ministry. We also take an Ignatian approach, inspired by St. Ignatius of Loyola, who was the founder of the Jesuits, the religious order to which we belong, which means using language like discernment. We're a mobile team, so we need to be discerned. Where are the needs greatest? Where can we have the best impact? Where can we work for the greater good? So emerging needs that we're seeing on the border or around the country are things like court accompaniment, court witnessing, as I talked about, the injustices happening there. ICE detention centers in the United States, where people are being detained and often detained for prolonged time so that they might sign for their voluntary departure. And then there's the deported population, Mexicans and non-Mexicans. So those are some of the emerging trends we're seeing under the Trump administration. So how are we, in particular, responding? We continue to visit 6 shelters in northern Mexico, and then 2 ICE detention centers and 1 migrant shelter in Texas. So Senda 1 and Senda 2 are 2 shelters we visit that are run by evangelical pastors, but we collaborate with them well. We provide humanitarian aid and celebrate masses there. We also visit Casa del Migrante, run by the Catholic Church, and staffed by the Daughters of Charity, a group of Catholic religious women. We also visit Casa Lulu, run by a great and tireless advocate and medical expert, Lulu. In Matamoros, we visit Casa del Migrante, another Catholic-run shelter where we celebrate Mass. We had those 10 baptisms and 2 First Communions on December 24th. We visit that Capre shelter that houses deported Mexican citizens, or Mexican nationals. And in Texas, we visit La Posada Providencia. It's one of the only remaining shelters in Texas. It's still open. It's got a very small population, less than 20 people. Some of them are members who were unhoused, and others are migrants who need a place to live. And then we started going to 2 detention centers. Both of them have a capacity for about 1,000 people. The one pictured up top before this little detention center is only men, but the one pictured down here in Raymondville, Valle, it has men's dorms and women's dorms. You can kind of tell in this picture just how inhospitable it is. As you can probably tell, there are no windows in these dormitories. They house 100 people. You can see the beds are all made of metal and they're drilled into the ground so they can't move. And you're just given a blanket and you sleep on that metal bunk. In the middle, there's a handful of metal kind of picnic tables with seats, again, just connected to the ground. And then the bathroom, toilets and showers are on the right next to the picnic benches. And they've got a wall that's about chest high, and that's all the privacy you get for bathing and using the bathroom. And they put 100 people in one of these dorms. Again, we say it's a detention center, not a prison, but look at that picture and imagining living every day of your life in there and tell me that that is not a prison. Every migrant has a story, and I've shared some stories already, but I'd like to share maybe 1 or 2 more, and then maybe I'll share 1 more for now, and then give you some takeaways for each of you to go home with, and then we're going to open it up for all the questions, comments you can have, so we can have a little bit of a conversation. So the story I want to share is relevant because it ends here in Houston, Texas, where we are today. And that's a story of resilience, the story of Yamilet. Yamilet is a woman from Honduras who came up to the U.S.-Mexico border. Her kids, her 2 teenage kids, had come up to the U.S. Years before as unaccompanied minors and were living here in Houston. And so she wanted to finally come up and be with them. She got them out of Honduras because they were having problems and difficulties and the violence of the gangs and cartels. And so she wanted to stay and care for her mother, but she wanted her kids to get out so that they might be safe. And so they came up to the United States and settled here in Houston as teenagers under the care of some family members. And then once the oldest girl, once she turned 19, 18, but really once she turned 19, she moved into her apartment and started caring for her brother as well. Yamilet, she great, bubbling personality. She came and ran the kitchen at one of the shelters from day 1 of her getting there. Here she is preparing famous Honduran baleadas, one of the famous dishes from Honduras. A big flour tortilla, handmade, filled with beans and eggs and a variety of other items that you can put in it. And she prepared baleadas for the entire shelter, over 500 people. Yamilet waited for a CBP-1 appointment, and then finally getting her CBP-1 appointment in September of 2024, a couple months before the elections. She entered the United States and came up here to Houston. And just the other day, while I was in town, just on Saturday, this past weekend, me and Father Fabio and Joe, the members of our team, met with Yamilet and her oldest daughter, and we were over not far from Straight Jesuit, and we got breakfast with her. And she's just talking about the challenges of the struggle. She works at a restaurant 5 days a week, Monday through Friday. Her daughter works at a hospital and works the evening shift, and she works 2 weekends a month as well. So they really kind of overlap for days off just a couple times a month. So kind of recounting to us how the American dream isn't necessarily all it lives up to, but it's still quite a struggle here. But she is getting by. She's got her 2 kids with her. She's doing the best she can. She's supposed to have a asylum case heard a week ago today. They got postponed because apparently there was a big snow and ice storm here in Houston. So it's been postponed to the end of this month, and she continues in that journey. You know, I do want to share one more story. I can't not tell the story of Nessie because it just touches me so much. So Nessie, another single mom from Honduras, came up to the border with Dylan and Alexa and her 2 kids. Dylan, who was I think 6 or 7 years old, the kid just loves to sing, And so during our Mass, when we got to communion, we were giving out communion, we just handed him a mic, and he would sing a church song a cappella into the mic. Dylan is just a terrible singer. I mean, he really got no voice. Now, I would never tell him that. And if you were here right now, I would tell him he was a great singer. And if you tell him Brian said this, I'm not lying. Okay. So, because he's got just a heart of gold. And he's the kind of kid you're sitting there doing an activity with, and he's just like making a little heart, like he's doing that heart. And then he just looks at you and he's like, you know what, Brian, I just love you. I just love you so much. Dylan, I love you too. You're just the best. So Nessie and her kids, they got a CDP1 appointment early 2024. And went up to North Carolina. They reunited with Nessie's sister, who's been living in Charlotte for a while. So Nessie's sister is holding Alexa, and then Nessie is meeting her niece for the first time, and she's holding in her arms. And she got settled in Charlotte and started working 2 jobs. She got a work permit. She works for the school district office at headquarters during the day, and in the evenings she works at Walmart. So she's doing the best she can. Single mom, trying to care for 2 kids. Both Dylan and Alexa are in school. They're doing well. Learning English and progressing in their studies. And a year ago, when Christmas time came around, I got some messages over WhatsApp from her, and I was chatting with her. It wasn't unusual every couple months to just check in and see how things are going in the shelter in Mexico, and I'd ask her how she's doing and stuff like that. But this time, as it was early December, late November, as she's texting me, she's like, yeah, no, actually the reason I want to check in with you, Father Brian, is, you know, I'm just remembering last year when I was in that shelter during Christmas, and how hard that was. And so, you know, is there any way you could help me out? If I sent you $100 as a gift, could you bring it over to the shelter as a donation? And actually, I've already talked to 5 other families who were also in the shelter at that time, and I've encouraged them to join with me. And all 5 of them have agreed. So if I sent you $600, could you get that cash and bring it to the shelter and give it to the sisters to help improve the experience for the people who are in the shelter celebrating Christmas this year? I'm reminded of that gospel story, right, where Jesus is looking at the treasury, and people are coming by and getting their donation, and all of a sudden the widow comes up and puts a few small coins in. And Jesus asks his disciples, who was it that gave most generously? And he says, it was that woman, because she gave from her life. A messy, single mom, caring for her 2 kids, working 2 jobs, just trying to get by. What's she thinking about Christmas? Not, I need to make sure I buy the best Christmas presents for my kids. They were in a shelter last year. No, she's thinking, and I'm sure she didn't have, but she's also thinking about the people in the shelter this year. How can I make their experience better? When our government says we want mass deportations and we're deporting criminals, I'm reminded of stories like Nessie. Nessie is someone that I want in my community, that I want in my parish, that I want to live next to, that I want her kids going to the local school. This is not someone that's stealing our jobs, that's a danger and risk to our country that needs to be detained and deported. It's a person with human dignity, right? Who has a generosity that inspires me and humbles me, that I might be as generous as Nessie. Immigration, as we're learning, as Trump has taught us anything, he's taught us a lot of things, but one thing is that immigration is not a border issue. The typical dynamics along the border have always been heavy surveillance, heavy and often violent policing. Those dynamics that have always marked the border are now marking cities around the country, right? We've seen what's been happening in Minneapolis, where even protesters are being filmed and caught on camera so that ICE can track where protesters are going. Surveillance, right? The policing that we're seeing, mass agents without identifying features, without a body cam, heavily armed, in the streets of our cities, knocking on doors, asking people for papers. The border dynamic has been spread across the country. But I'll also say that immigrant migrants are spread across the country. I put a marker here at every place that I've known a migrant who's passed through the border in the shelters that I visited have ended up. And I've got a marker in every 48 of the contiguous states of the U.S. I haven't had anyone go to Alaska or Hawaii yet, but it's probably only a matter of time. And so immigration is an issue that's relevant to all of us, regardless of where we live. We know that. I mean, Houston is a huge city of immigrants, right? It's got a history of diversity that we celebrate, that marks this city with great pride. And so how can we respond? We talked about reading the reality and respond to it. I want to leave you with just a few suggestions on how you can respond. One, I always share the same instructions that Jesus gave to his early disciples: come and see. I think everyone I know who's come to the border to see the border reality has been impacted by that experience. The border features heavily in the news all the time, and the stories told about it don't match the reality. And the best way to learn the reality is to see for yourself. So if you've never made a trip to the border, I encourage you to find a way to get down there, have an immersion experience, and see the reality for yourself. Of course, we can also be very involved locally, volunteering and witnessing. Migrants around our country living in fear and uncertainty. What groups can you find are active in your community here, maybe through your parish, maybe through your school, maybe through your neighborhood, to help care for migrants? I keep hearing, as I travel around the country, occasionally giving talks, I hear stories of people coming up to me and saying, yeah, Brother Brian, actually in my neighborhood, we started delivering groceries to a handful of families. Or we started doing school pickup for kids, for a few families where the parents are afraid to leave their house. It's terrifying that people have to live in such fear, but there are ways for us to just mobilize and help one another locally in our local community. Immigration court is open to the public. You can find the immigration court here in Houston and visit there, accompanying migrants who are sitting in the waiting room, terrified of what could happen, serving witness to the injustices that sometimes unfold there. You can support organizations and migrants themselves. All the support that we get goes especially to shelters in northern Mexico, where people like Judy and her 3 kids that we baptized and gave first communion to are staying and living and struggling. So you can support us and other organizations. Advocate for change. Be a voice for a voiceless. You know why it's really easy to target migrants and to say migrants are a problem in our country? Because migrants can't vote, despite what any political politician might tell you. Migrants can't vote, right? And so, I mean, imagine, it's an election season, and I'm a politician, I'm going around telling everyone, the problem with our country is Catholics. They're stealing our jobs, they're committing crimes. I mean, I don't know if it's large, but here's one story of a heinous crime committed by one Catholic. It's a danger. We need to get rid of them. We need to put them in prisons. We need to expel them from the country. And if I did that, if I said, that's a real problem, it's Catholics, guess what would happen at the polls? Catholics would be like, I'm not voting for that person. And there's a lot of Catholics that vote. And so no politician is going to get up and say that. Now, if you say the same thing and just substitute the word migrant for Catholic, you can get away with it, right? Migrants are flooding our country. They're stealing our jobs. They commit crimes. I mean, maybe not a large rate, but look at this one story. This heinous crime committed by a migrant. We need to get rid of them. We need to detain them and expel them from the country. And what happens in the polls? Well, no migrants able to vote. So it relies on someone moved with compassion to vote on behalf of the needs of someone else. So if you're over 18 and a U.S. citizen, I invite you to vote. I invite you to call your senators and representatives in Congress and say, I oppose this campaign of mass deportation. Right? That is a priority for me as one of your constituents. Be a voice for the voiceless, for those who can't call up a senator or representative and say that. Call for pathways to citizenship. People with these temporary protected statuses like DACA recipients. You know, I'm sure we have students here at Rice who are DACA recipients. It provides no legal pathway. And as soon as the president, legally, with approval of the courts, removes DACA, that entire population is left undocumented. After having to renew it every 2 years, a lengthy process, paying money to do so, laborious, trying to do things the right way, and they're given no legal pathway to citizenship. And oftentimes the only reason we don't move it, we don't pass it, is because politicians on both sides of the board, on both sides of the aisle, want to attach more challenging legislation to get that passed. Because if you just put it on the floor and said, DACA, pathway to citizenship, yes or no, almost all the country would say yes. The majority of the country, the majority of our politicians would say yes. And yet, still remains unresolved. Call your representatives, tell them this matters, get this passed. And we need immigration reform. The current system clearly is broken and needs widespread reform. What else can you do? Oh yes, you can subscribe to our podcast. So the Jesuit Border Podcast, we share stories like the short stories I shared with you today about our ministry, highlighting the reality on the border across the country. We interview great people, advocates, authors, theologians, bishops, priests, religious men and women to share the great work that they're doing. We're launching the 10th season in just a couple weeks on Tuesday, February 17th. So if you listen on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, I will not be embarrassed if you get out your cell phone right now and look it up and subscribe to it. It's perfectly fine with me. So please check it out, give us a listen, and share. And so with that, I'm going to pause and open it up for questions and comments. And thank you for taking time out of your Monday to come and be with us and to listen to this issue that's very close to my heart and very close to a lot of us. So thank you. So I respect anybody who might need to get off to something else that's starting or get back to studying for a test or otherwise. But those who are still here, we have time, and now's a great opportunity for you to ask any questions or share any comments from your own life and experience. What questions do you have? Go ahead.
Okay, so you talked a lot about what it's like actually on the border, because a lot of us don't experience it. But it seems like in the 2024 election, we saw a lot of counties along the border trend red, seemingly to really respond to like anti-immigration rhetoric. And a lot of analysts contribute that to a lot of the population there being Latino or religious or seemingly having a problem with immigration on the border. Could you shed some light on maybe why that might be?
Yeah, great question. I actually love to talk about this because I would say yes, like the Rio Grande Valley where I live went red and voted for Trump. That never happens. It's usually very blue. It's 85% Latino, a population that tends to vote more Democrat. And I would say, as someone who lives down there, that the immigration issue is pretty low on their priority list. The two things that really resonated with the population on the border where I lived were, first and foremost, it was the economy. And so when you have a politician saying the economy is doing fine, that inflation isn't a big deal because real wages are outpacing inflation, that might be true, but if you shop with a calculator in your hand, that doesn't resonate. And when another politician is saying, hey, remember when I was president before? Your groceries were cheaper. That may or may not even have anything to do with who the president is, right? I mean, inflation, economy, the president doesn't have control over all of that, but that was a message that resonated. And the other issue that really resonated was the transgender issue. And that was the other thing that was being pushed a lot on ads saying, you know, this one party wants boys playing girls sports. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I saw that ads. And in kind of a conservative part of the country, that was kind of terrifying. And those were the two issues that resonated. I mean, what I did not see was people, I mean, there are exceptions to this, but I did not see people, by and large, people I know who voted for the Republican ticket, weren't saying immigration is the problem. That was like not even really kind of on the radar. And what I'll also tell you, now we're in 2026, is that a lot of people who voted for Trump don't like what he's doing around immigration in the ballot. Again, there are exceptions, but it's affecting so many families. There are so many mixed status families in our area where the grandparents are undocumented, but their kids and grandkids are all students. Or mixed status families. You know, a woman at my parish, her husband was telling me that she went to the grocery store. She's a green card holder. She's legal permanent resident. She's at the grocery store, and an ICE agent was there just picking up milk. He was off duty, but he was wearing his ICE uniform. And she had to call her husband because she started having a panic attack. Like just the fear. In a sense, you want to say, oh, you got nothing to fear. I mean, you're a green card holder. But that's the environment we're cultivating. People are feeling that in the valley. I mean, I got another family that's there, and they were telling me, I love breakfast with them at Denny's the other day, and they were telling me, they're like, we only go out for work and church. Those are the only two things we go to, the parents. They said everything else we have our teenage kids do. They're born in the U.S., the kids were. And so if they want to go grocery shopping, if they want to fill the car with gas, they tell their kids to go do the instructions for their kids to do. This is the environment that we're seeing. So I would say the immigration issue wasn't the key factor in swinging the election the way it did in those border states. There are exceptions. I mean, I know people down there who said, my family did it the right way, how do you do it the right way, with having some misconceived notions about what immigration really looks like. So that's definitely there. But that wasn't enough to swing the election. It was the economy and gender identity issues, I think, is what tipped the election in those areas. So, thanks for that question. Yes, please.
Thank you so much for sharing so many helpful stories with us. I was wondering, do you have any specific rhetoric or facts or tactics that might help convince someone who's not as aware of specific migrant stories or the struggles that they face, or are maybe swayed by some of the arguments that the administration has against migrants, like they're criminals, and all of that?
Yeah, exactly. No, great questions. I mean, if I had the perfect package for that, I'd be pushing it out all the time. I think it's complicated. It depends on the person and kind of what they bring into it. I've given talks to people who don't agree with the things I'm talking about, and I've asked pointed questions. I love to debate some of the issues because I think a lot of it, I am thoroughly convinced that the majority of people holding entrenched anti-immigration attitudes are just misinformed, and it's an issue of facts and issues and not really beliefs. So that gives me hope that things can change and swing on this. And so, migrants are all criminals, right? That's part of the narrative. Well, migrants commit crimes at a lower rate than U.S. citizens. Only about 3% of migrants have ever been accused or convicted of a crime. Even this campaign of mass deportations, 70% of the people that have been picked up have no criminal background. The only thing on the record is an immigration infraction, which, like I said at the beginning, that's a civil offense. It's like a misdemeanor, like speeding. Now think about it, if we want to talk about law and order is what matters, right? Well, law and order tells us that the punishment should be commensurate to the crime, right? So now, what are we doing? Juliana, been in the country for 29 years. She's got 5 kids. She's paid her taxes. She's got a job. Her and her husband own a house. Okay, she's committed one civil infraction, undocumented entry. That's the only offense she has against her. And what we've decided the just punishment is to detain her for 3 months, separate her from her family, and expel her from the country with a 10-year ban on re-entry. Is that commensurate to the crime committed? If I'm caught speeding today, would it be fair for someone to cut off my foot and steal my car? I mean, we would say that's ridiculous. That does not fit the crime at all. So if we want to be a party of law and order, let's make just laws and let's have just punishments that fit the crime, right? And so if we find the worst of the worst, we want to detain them and put them through removal proceedings. Guess what? Every president has done that. This is not the first president to go after migrants who are here who have committed crimes. I think it's also important to talk about who the undocumented population is. First of all, sometimes you hear numbers that it's 20 to 30 million undocumented migrants. Just about every credible study on both sides of the aisle will tell you the number is nowhere near that. The best estimates I'm hearing right now, today, based on 2024 data, 2025, are 14 million undocumented migrants. 14 million. But here's the thing that we don't even talk about. Of those 14 million, about 6 of them have status in our country. About 6 million of them include people who have DACA, who have TPS, temporary protected status, who are in asylum proceedings. In other words, they're not just here unbeknownst to the government speaking around or whatever. I mean, they are living transparent lives and are protected from deportation by the government. That's almost half the population. And then we're going to talk about the others who are undocumented. 40% of them are visa overstays. So we highlight the border, but we don't talk about the doctor from Israel who came on his visa with his wife and overstayed the visa and is working in a hospital, right? We don't talk about that as like criminals flooding our country and stealing our jobs. So a lot of misinformation out there, misconceptions. So, I try to stick with the facts, I try to share the stories, but it's tough because you hear, both sides of the aisle can use stories, right? You hear the story of a college girl going for a run, right, who gets attacked and raped by an immigrant killed, who's from Venezuela and came in the country under Biden. Who is not impacted by hearing that story? And that is tragic. That is tragic. And obviously that requires prosecution under the law. But to paint the picture of every migrant with that brush, what are we doing? And I will say, and I want to say this too very clearly, that I wouldn't do the same thing with ICE agents. We've got ICE agents, we've got Border Patrol agents, we've got CBP officers who are members of our Catholic parishes on the border. And a lot of them, it's a good job that has a pension, that gives good Social Security. We live in one of the poorest zip codes in the entire United States of America. It's like one of the best jobs you can have, right? And guys I know in my parish, and men and women, they don't like what's happening around the country. They didn't sign up for this. And so I don't want to paint, there are 3 ICE agents who pull guns on U.S. citizens who shot. Okay, I think they should be held accountable under the law, just like a migrant who might kill a young girl, right? But I'm not going to paint every ICE agent with that brush. And so I think I would encourage all of us to do that, right? To not stereotype and generalize, right? To remember that everyone, the person behind the mask and the person arrested, is a human person that deserves our dignity. And if anything, I want to stir up the conscience of ICE agents, of immigration judges who are dismissing cases, who are part of the charade, to say, step forward, resist this policy of injustice. Take a stand. You really get me going asking a question like that. Sorry, I just keep throwing things out there, but I hope that's been somewhat helpful. But It is difficult to combat anti-immigrant rhetoric. I hear it on the news, I hear the things, and it's helpful for me sometimes to hear it, because I'm like, really? People think that? Okay, it's good to know people think that, so I know how to respond to that misinformation. Yes, sir.
So when you were first given this assignment, I would expect that you felt somewhat overwhelmed because you were starting up the entire ministry. Do you now feel less overwhelmed or even more overwhelmed knowing these stories and how they impact you?
Yeah, great question. I mean, it is a very challenging mission, without a doubt. I mean, you're working with people experiencing trauma every day in ministry. But what keeps me going is the faith and hope that I see in the people themselves. You know, January 20th, this announcement goes out last year, right, that the border is closed, all people, these appointments are canceled. January 24th, we went into a shelter and celebrated Mass there, right? And after we celebrated Mass, it was filled with all people who had an appointment that was now canceled, and so they weren't going to be able to get in the United States. And so we opened up a space after Mass and said, what do you want to share? How are you feeling, right? People raised their hands and said, you know, I'm feeling devastated. I feel deceived, like I was given this promise that if I did things right, I'd get in the country, be able to seek asylum, and now I feel like I've been lied to. And as everyone was expressing their angst and frustrations and their despair, Sandra raised her hand from the back of the room. And I asked her to share, and she stood up and she said, you know, Padre Brian, la esperanza es lo último que se pierde. Hope is the last thing we lose. I was so struck by that. I was thinking, what could be a more despairing situation than the one they're in right now? But as I was reflecting on it, as I drove home that afternoon, I thought, I think Sandra's got this right, because she doesn't put her hope in some smartphone app. She doesn't put her hope in some politician or political party. She puts her hope in the Lord. And that's a hope that doesn't disappoint. And if Sandra can stare into the darkness, to stare into despair, and find light and find hope, then I can too. And so has it become more overwhelming over time? In a lot of ways, yes. The more you hear these stories, the more you carry them. But every story includes a story like Nessie, right? Who's calling me up and asking if she can send money down to support the shelter, right? Those stories of light and strength that help to carry me and help me go forward, even when at times it feels like more than I can even carry myself. Yeah, go ahead.
This is a continuation to the ministerial approach. Do you find that there's a specific point of your Jesuit formation that has informed how you approach dealing with some of these harder stories, or is it maybe just something more personal to you?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I definitely think that my formation as a Jesuit gave me a ton of tools that were helpful. For me to sustain myself in a situation of trauma, it requires regular prayer, it requires a work-life balance, good community life, exercise, things like that help me stay balanced. But I'll also say, I mean, I've known people who've been on the board with all those tools and just can't sustain themselves in the work. And so part of me thinks there is something about your character that allows you to do it, you know? There are a lot of nurses around the country, but not every nurse can work in the oncology ward for children, right? Like a cancer ward for kids, or work in the emergency room, right? So I think sometimes experiencing, accompanying people with trauma, sometimes there's something just built into us that helps us to sustain ourselves. So I felt like I got a lot of great tools from the Jesuits. That includes the daily examen, where we're reviewing the day, seeing where God was present, seeing where maybe we didn't respond well to the grace of God. It makes me just continually reflexive, and that's really important, because you need it, because moments happen. And, you know, a priest in general often goes from, you know, you do a funeral in the morning and a baptism or a wedding in the afternoon. So you have these highs and lows of people mourning a death to people celebrating a new life. We get that sometimes like in 5 minutes, right? Like you're talking with one person and they're sharing something that's making you smile, and then the next person comes and you're like, that is the heaviest thing I've ever heard in my life. And so how do you kind of be discerning about how am I receiving this? How am I listening to this? It's that kind of constant reflection, which have been tools that I've cultivated as a Jesuit over 15 years that have served me very well. But again, even I think with the best tools, sometimes working with people, accompanying people with extreme trauma, where there is a ton of secondary trauma, some of it just takes, sometimes I think this is the right character sometimes to do it. But that's just kind of my takeaway in these few years being down there. So it's not, this kind of work isn't for everyone. I really believe that. Just like, not every nurse can work in an oncology ward with children. Question there, yeah.
You mentioned the pretty stark differences between the border between different administrations.
Yeah.
Could you speak a little bit more about how that changes your ministerial approach, and but especially considering the lower populations at the asylums and shelters, and possibly what changes you still intend.
Sure, yeah. I'll share that. Actually, I want to lead with something first. So I want to say that we were never under invasion, okay? That was some of the first language being used by the Trump administration, that we've been invaded, and so that's why we didn't enact certain laws. We were never under invasion, right? I mean, I'd sit in my room on a Zoom call talking to people, and they'd be like, well, what's it like with the invasion? I look out my window, and I'm like, it looks okay. You know, I mean, what an insult to use that word when Ukrainian cities are being bombed and demolished. That's an invasion. Give me a break. We were never under invasion. Even get this, the peak year under the Biden administration, we had 2 million people enter the United States from Mexico. 2 million. You hear that number and you're like, that's crazy. That's a ton of people. I mean, never in that time, never in that year, would you walk around the streets of Brownsville and be like, oh my gosh, it's crazy. Because we've got a 2,000-mile border, and we've got Border Patrol doing its job, including people who are being processed at ports of entry or crossing between ports of entry and aren't trying to sneak anywhere. They're there to claim asylum, right? So there was always a lot of processing. We get images of hundreds of people surrounded by Border Patrol agents. Guess what? That means they were doing their job. Things were fun. 2 million entries sounds overwhelming. Okay, guess what? That year, we also had 1 million people leave the country, either because they were deported, left on their own, or died. Okay, so net gain, now it's half of this. Now it's half of that. Now it's 1 million. Still, you're like, but 1 million people, Father Brian, in 1 year, that's so many people. Okay, how many people live in the United States of America? About 330 million people, right? Okay, I went to a Jesuit high school. Let's say you got a high school, 1,000 people. It's the equivalent of adding 3 new students every year. Over the course of 4 years, look out, you would have 12 new students. I mean, is that taking over your school? Is that an invasion? Now, don't get me wrong, if you have one locker and you're surrounded by the other 12 students, you'd be like, man, things have really changed over these 4 years. But if we just spread their lockers out, you wouldn't even notice. And that was one of the biggest issues. One of the biggest political keys that happened for the last election was our governor, Abbott, in his busing program. He was taking migrants and busing them to specific cities, to Denver, Chicago, and New York primarily. He was manufacturing an immigration problem, okay? Imagine this, Olympic-sized swimming pool, okay? Olympic-sized swimming pool. If we stand on the 4 corners of it with a pitcher of pink Gatorade, and we close our eyes and all pour it in there and count to 10 and open our eyes, you know what? We're not even going to be able to recognize that Kool-Aid was poured into that pool, right? It's just going to dilute immediately. Now, same pool, we've all got a pitcher, and that Kool-Aid is pink, and it is now frozen. We close our eyes, we dump it in, we count to 10. We're going to say, there's that frozen Kool-Aid. I mean, it'll be melting, but there will still be a big glob in, right? So here's how that plays out in immigration, right? When Venezuelans first started coming to the country, and I meet them on the border, because that wasn't a big dynamic historically, and it's because of a number of factors, including post-COVID, I don't want to get into. But anyway, Venezuelans are coming to the country. I'm asking them, where are you going? They're on the border saying, I'm going to New York. I'm like, why are you going to New York? Who do you know there? Like, I don't know anyone in the U.S. I'm going to New York because I heard they'll give you a hotel room. Okay? That was their motives, right? Fast forward 6 months. I'm asking people, Venezuelans coming, maybe 6 to 12 months. I'm asking Venezuelans on the border, say, where are you going? They're like, oh, I'm going to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. I'm going to Madison, Wisconsin. I'm going to St. George, Utah. And I'm like, what? How do you know anybody there? Like, yeah, I've got a friend who lives there. And in every case, what had happened? Every case that I'm talking about, and it was the majority, was that Venezuelans coming, not knowing anybody in the country, were bused to one of 3 cities, usually Denver, Chicago, or New York, overwhelming their services because it was concentrating everyone in one space. And then they were trying to do the best. Eric Adams, governor of New York, said migrants are going to be the downfall of our city when migrants are built that city, right? But just an overwhelming sense. But then migrants are not idiots. They get into New York, they realize, wow, this city has a lot of people in it. Let me see where else I can go. And they end up in Connecticut or Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. They go to Chicago, they end up in Madison, Wisconsin. They're in Denver, they move to Utah. Right? If Governor Abbott could have saved money, he could have spent half the cost he did per migrant, if he just said, I'll give you a bus ticket to anywhere you want to go in the country. And guess what? If the Kool-Aid that wasn't frozen, they would have just spread out throughout the country where housing was affordable, where jobs were available, and you never would have had this crisis that was provoked, was manufactured, right? So even height of the Biden administration, 2 million entries was not a migration crisis. Migration is not a crisis. It's one of the most human things we can do. right? I myself, my family moved 5 times in the first 10 years, right? It's a very natural human phenomenon to migrate. And so to call it a crisis doesn't respect our natural urge to move for opportunity, for safety. If there's ever been a crisis, it's been a humanitarian crisis, for the way that we treat other human beings. I don't think I didn't answer your question in the end, but if you want to talk more about it, I'm happy to. I want to be respectful of people's time, but overeat. I'm going to hang around, so if anybody wants to come up, welcome to chat with you. But thank you again so much for being here with us.
I do very much encourage, especially all of there are so many different ways that you can help support. But I do very much advocate for the podcast that Father Ryan talked about, especially because I think something that helps dispel, especially misinformation, is learning more, especially hearing stories. You'll learn many more of these stories, and actually, if you go back to the podcast, you actually get a good sense of what's been going on for the past several years, as Brother Brian and other people on the podcast kind of help with that information. So it's a great way of being a little more informed, as well as hearing great personal stories. Thank you all for coming, and once again, thank you, Father Brian, for being here.